Chapter 8. Ruth lost her eye. It was as simple as that. I heard about it later that night from my mother. Most mothers might have waited until morning to deliver such news, but not my mother. She knew that I would have nightmares regardless. Everything was about to get worse, and waiting to face it would not change that. It could have been me, I told my mother when she came and sat at the edge of my bed in the dark and told me that the doctor had not been able to repair Ruth's eye, that no one could have repaired it. The rock had ruined the parts that Ruth needed in order to see. That's how my mother put it. Yes, she said, stroking my hair, it could have been you, Annabelle, but I think that rock was meant for Mr. Ansel or his grays or even his apples, not you, not Ruth. Why do you think that? My mother sighed. Well, Mr. Ansel is German, Annabelle, and a lot of people around here are angry with the Germans. Have been since the last big war, but especially now that we're in another one. It's not the first time someone has tried to do him harm. Though before this, they took it out on his crops or his truck, broke windows, put dead rats in his mailbox. But Mr. Ansel has lived here most of his life, I said. I know that, and you know that, but for some people, it doesn't make a difference. He's the nearest thing they have, and they want someone to blame. Who does? My mother chewed on her lip, didn't look at me. People who have lost sons or fathers or brothers in the war, this one or the last one, people who fought in the war and came home angry or hurt, and really most everyone, since we all know soldiers over there right now in harm's way because of the Germans. I thought about the gold stars on the flag at the church, one for each husband or brother or son who wouldn't come back to us. I thought about Toby, his silence, and his guns. But how could anybody in the hollow know that Mr. Ansel would be passing through just then? They had to be on the hill already. My mother shrugged. I don't know, Annabelle. I only know that no one was trying to hurt Ruth. What happened to her was just bad luck, which only made things worse. How was anyone supposed to stand up straight and open-eyed when luck could decide everything? The next day started hard and got harder. Breakfast was a quiet meal. Even my brothers were subdued. I didn't give a thought to anything but Ruth and what school would be like without her that day. Despite myself, I began to cry, but as quietly as I could. Aunt Lily said, "Oh, and what is it now that's worth such tears?" My grandmother said, without looking at her, "Even Jesus wept, Lily," to which Aunt Lily replied, "And with good reason, which is more than I can say about this business." "You mean Ruth losing her eye?" my mother said, some vinegar on her tongue. "You mean that business?" At which Aunt Lily said somewhat peevishly, "Well, if that's the root of it, I suppose I misjudged the bloom." Aunt Lily was always saying things like that, but admitting that she was wrong was a rare thing. I didn't say anything at all. James and Henry ate their breakfast like puppies, noisy and quick. But my father drank his coffee slowly, his face grim, somewhere else. "Stay away from the road and the hill at recess," he said before the boys and I went out the door. "Keep to the other side of the schoolhouse, by the woods. I mean to find out what happened to Ruth. Until then, don't go near the hill. Do you understand me?" "Yes," we nodded. "Mind your sister," he told the boys, which was like telling them to fly to the moon. But the boys, too, surprised me, waiting until we reached the fields on the down slope above Wolf Hollow before breaking away at a run to spook a grouse at the edge of the woods and then disappearing down the path into the trees without me. When the path turned and I saw Betty sitting on a stump ahead, I was filled with regret that the reprieve I'd had was over and I was again to be her target. But then I felt something else rise in its place. I can't call it courage, since that's what people have when they are scared, but do hard things regardless. And I can't call it anger, though I'd been angry at Betty for the bruises she'd given me and the threats she'd made and the quells she'd killed. I suppose I should have been both afraid and angry, but Ruth had lost her eye the day before, and what I felt now, looking at Betty's empty face, was more like indifference. She seemed, on that morning, insignificant and small, even as she stepped out in front of me. "What?" I said impatiently. She looked at me curiously. "Did you think I would leave you alone just because that crazy man told me to? Or because your little friend got hurt?" "She got more than hurt," I said. "She lost her eye, Betty. Did you know that?" Betty looked away. "My grandma told me. I'll bet someone was aiming for that filthy German, not her." "Mr. Ansel isn't filthy," I said. "You don't even know him." She raised her eyebrows. "Way out here in these woods, you might not know much, but I do. He might act all nice and jolly, but Germans are bullies who aim to take over the world, and they will if they can." I noticed a long red thread of fresh scab across Betty's cheek, as if she'd been in brambles, and her socks were stuck all over with stick tights. I thought it odd that she'd been out in the rough so early in the day, and so soon after the ivy had laid her low. "You're the only bully I know, Betty," I said, "but you're going to leave me alone now, and not because Toby said so, and not because Ruth got hurt. You just will. I'm not going to give you anything. I'm not going to worry about you. I'm not going to run away from you. I'm just not. So you might as well leave me alone and get on with something else." I waited, looking her full in the face, determined not to cut this short. I wanted to be done with Betty. If she was going to hurt me, she could hurt me right then and there, and I could finally do something about it before the day was out. But she didn't do anything except spend another moment thoughtful, and then she stepped aside. I wasn't relieved. I wasn't happy about being left alone. I wasn't anything much, just so sad and tired in a way I'd never been before. I wanted nothing more than to hide in the hayloft in the barn and watch the rock doves napping in the rafters, to close my eyes and think about nothing at all, not Ruth, not Mr. Ansel, not Germans, and not Betty Glengarry. But if I couldn't retreat to the barn, school was the next best thing, and I gave myself over to my lessons. Andy didn't come to school that morning, so Benjamin reclaimed his customary seat. No one sat with me, as Ruth usually did, and we all passed the morning quietly. When recess came, I sat on the steps with some of the other girls, making crowns from long grass and supposing what Ruth might be doing instead. The whole while I kept an eye on my brothers, but they didn't go near the road or the hill on the other side of it. As usual, they spent their time racing each other from here to there, making mud pies in the dirt around the well, and throwing rocks through the forks of trees. Betty stood and watched them with her arms crossed. She never played. Usually she went off somewhere with Andy, but today, without him, she sat by herself and waited for recess to be over. Today she seemed more intent than usual, but she did not look at me once the whole time, so I paid her little attention in return. And then, just as Mrs. Taylor called us back into the school, Andy came strolling into the yard. Betty went to meet him halfway across the clearing, and they spent a moment together, talking, glancing at me as they did, before following us into school. I wondered what they were saying and what it had to do with me. For the rest of the day, Andy and Betty passed notes and looks, ignored Mrs. Taylor when she asked them to join her at the chalkboard for arithmetic, and were the first two out the door when she dismissed us. By the time I left the schoolhouse, they were nowhere in sight. I didn't mind then when my brothers took off for home, racing each other up the hill and out of sight by the time I made it to the first turn in the path. I heard them, though. First, the sound of them racing away, the thud of their feet, a breathless "hey!" the mumble of loose petals on the path, then a stretch of silence as they put more distance between us, and then a scream, and then Henry calling my name. I ran to them up that hill as if it were flat ground. I found Henry kneeling over James, who lay on his back in the path, crying, his forehead covered in blood. I dropped to my knees beside them. "I don't know what happened," Henry said. "James was ahead of me, and he just suddenly fell back and started to cry." "No, I didn't just fall down," James wailed, rolling onto his belly and pushing up onto his knees. He pointed along the path, and there, just ahead, was a wire strung tight between two trees. When Henry stood to have a closer look, I saw that the wire could have caught him in the neck if he'd been in the lead. Henry ran his finger along the wire and jerked back. "It's sharp right here above the path," he said, like someone filed it. He stepped into the brush and unwound the wire from one of the trees where it was anchored, coiled the wire carefully, and left it hanging from the tree on the other side of the path. I used my sleeve to blot the blood from my brother's face. The cut was deep enough to bleed a lot, but it wasn't too bad. "Come on," I said to James, helping him to his feet. "We'll get you fixed up just fine." I took him by the hand, and he let me, still blubbering. Henry went along in front, head up, as quiet and serious as a bull. From time to time, he turned to look at me and James. At one point, as we crossed the fallow field on the brow of the hill, he turned and then stopped short. I looked back and saw Betty at the mouth of the path into the hollow watching us. "Not now," I said to Henry, who seemed to know what I meant. He stood stock still and watched her as James and I hurried past. "Not now," I said again, and he turned to follow us home. The wire was gone when I led my father back to where it had been. "I know it was here," I said, "just where the hump of root is. I made sure of it so I wouldn't forget." My father stepped off the path and fingered the pale scar on the tree where the wire had taken a bite. There was another like it on the other side of the path. "You remembered right, Annabelle. This is where he tied the wire." My father didn't get angry very often. My mother usually got angry first, so there wasn't much need for him to get involved. But this was different. Someone has a snake in him, and it's woken up, he said quietly. I thought that was a very odd thing for him to say. He sounded a little like the Reverend at our church or Aunt Lily when she got going, though he was not for the most part a churchy kind of man. But it's not a he, I don't think, I said. Or if it is a he, it's a she, too, probably. At least I think it's a she. At least I think it is. A she, I mean. My father looked at me curiously. Annabelle, it'd be easier if you just spit it out. And I will. I just can't be sure because I didn't see her do it. But I am sure, I guess. It couldn't be anyone else unless it was Andy, too. It was cold in the woods, the light going quickly, and I was happy to follow my father when he suddenly headed for the open fields above us. He took my hand as we crossed them, cut his stride down to half so I could keep up, and stopped at the top of the lane to pick a dozen apples for the sauce my mother would make that night. Then we went together down the lane through the trees that arched overhead toward the house. Only after we got inside and warm, spent a moment with James, my father calling him a good little man, and another with my mother, who gave us both a long look, did he sit me down in the front room, quieter there than the kitchen, and ask me to say what was on my mind. So I told him everything, from the beginning. About Betty and her threats, about the cucumber-shaped bruise on my hip, how Andy and Betty had become friends so quickly and how furtive they had been for days now, about the quail and what Toby had done, about Andy coming late to school that morning and how the two of them had huddled in the schoolyard at recess whispering. I ran out of things to say, and realized to my dismay that none of it sounded nearly as bad as it had felt at the time, though the memory of the quail's neck breaking would stay with me for the rest of my days. She's a terrible bully, I said, but I still don't know why I was so scared of her. Annabelle, why didn't you tell us right when she started up? It happened in little bits, not all at once, and it wasn't easy to figure out what to do along the way. I felt like such a terrible fool. Besides, she said she would hurt the boys if I told anyone, and then she went ahead and hurt James anyway when I wouldn't do what she said. My father stood up and scrubbed his jaw with an open hand. It's all right, he said. I will take care of this now. Annabelle, your mother and I, but from now on, you tell us right away when you have a problem. Do you promise? I did. It was an easy promise to make. I had no intention of lying to my father or mother about anything else. I just didn't know how complicated things would become.